Now, at that corner of the city block, you have got a set of ironwork gates. At this corner, you've got a set of ironwork gates. Those are cast iron, these are wrought iron. These ones had our cute little judicial tunnel park right behind them. That one has a great, big, massive parking garage right behind them. And on the gates, there's a little sign that says Quaker Cemetery. Any y'all scroll by there today?
Yeah, we did. We read about it. We were like, oh, there's a parking garage here.
That's
the one. Right at the Quaker Cemetery.
Exactly. So you guys actually are going to know a lot of this if you've stopped and read that. But we're going to share it. So it has to do with back in the early days of our colony, we had a surprising amount of religious freedom at a time when that just really wasn't how they did things, and that attracted a lot of different groups to Charleston in the late 1600s. And that included the Quakers. Now the Quakers are a very specific religious group, very specific cultural beliefs, all that good stuff, and they were very strong abolitionists. And you guys know what abolition is?
No slaves.
That's right, end of slavery. So you know where it's really important to have a lot of abolitionists? Places where you have a lot of slavery, right? No, please, this is an interactive thing. You know where it's really hard to be an abolitionist? Places where you have a lot of slavery. So coming up into the mid-1800s, things were kind of heating up around here, leading up to the Civil War, and so a lot of the Quakers actually ended up leaving town. Prior to that, it was actually quite a large community, and they had a little meeting house right sitting on that corner. Again, you would have seen this on the sign. Meeting house was their preferred term for a church, and next to it they had their graveyard. Now, did you guys know there's a difference between a graveyard and a cemetery?
Yes.
Yeah, did you learn that here?
No,
Really?
Another tour guide asked us. It was raised in another tour that we took earlier today.
Okay, so do you want to tell us what it is?
The cemetery is attached to the church.
Other way around.
I see.
Yeah, it's the other way around. So the graveyard is attached to the church, and the cemetery is not attached to the church.
See.
So the graveyard sits on the same plot of land, and cemetery is separate. So for that reason, a graveyard will always be affiliated with a church, and a cemetery may or may not be. It just kind of depends. So think of it like this. If you have grass next to your house, that's your yard. If it's elsewhere in the city, it's a park. So yard, graveyard, park, cemetery. Make sense? So they had a little graveyard. Then, about 100 years later, okay? So you've got most of those, actually, sorry, I skipped over a section. So most of the Quakers ended up leading up to the Civil War. And then in 1861, the Great Fire of 1861 came right down that street, burning the meeting house to the ground. And that turned the graveyard into a cemetery. So now the main Quakers that are left in town, the dead ones. And everything's fine for about 100 years. And then in the 1960s, the city of Charleston decided that they really, really needed a parking garage. And they really needed it to go right there on that. So what they ended up doing was deciding to move the Quakers, which is just not, it was not a great plan, to be honest with you. And the people that they hired to do it were a big part of the problem. So they come in and they're move them, right? So they load up all of the stones, all of the gravestones, get them all packed out, and then they come back for the people, and they realize they've forgotten to write down who every records all burned with the church, so they don't have anything to go. So they just kind of sifted that sucker like it was a sandbox and got whatever they could all together in a nice big pile and put them in a mass grave right behind you in that little plot of grass. So this is the new Quaker Cemetery. And we're here to say hello because it is probably the most overlooked burial ground that we have in town.
They didn't put anything there to...
Oh, they do have a little plaque, but it's really easy to miss. So I'm going to show you. But yeah, you know, it doesn't look like anything.
Stone.
Exactly. So we're going to come over here and we're going to say hello. And then we're going to
Oh, it's that plaque right there.
that over there is for the Lathams. So if you look
Oh, burial ground, I see.
Oh, so this has all the names of the...
I think
as far as I can tell, they basically just
Took all the names?
yeah, there. Thank you. You got to before I did. They basically just took all the names off of the stones in alphabetical order and just listed
1720
them with their year of death. Now that marker back in there, and you can go have a look if you want to. That is for the Lathams. They're the bottom on the left, and it's Daniel and Sarah and their kids.
So it's a mass grave.
As far as they know, they're all in there. Yep. Now, when they went digging to find them, these were not embalmed bodies in sealed coffins. So they were largely decomposed, and you're mostly looking at bones and bits and pieces and whatever they could find.
Yeah.
So we don't know that they got all of them. We don't know that all of these people have any parts in here. This is just sort of that's what you call a hatchet job. And they just kind of did the best they could and made it work. So
1820.
we're going to talk
How
about
many, like, they gotta have relatives that are still alive that found out about this. I would assume there are some, like,
The following
settlements that
originally
had to be
were
stepped or something like that.
Well, see, here's what I wonder, because the Lathams, we actually have some interesting laws when it comes to dealing with old burial grounds in Charleston. A little bit different than a lot of places, but it's not against the law to move them. There's just ways you're supposed to do it, ways you're not supposed to do it, and this was messy. Yeah, but again, it was the 1960s. Now, these ones on the bottom here, the Lathams, we do still have Lathams in town. I don't know if they're technically the same family, but I think they might be because that marker is for the Lathams, and I think it may have been placed later by the family. I've never been able to track that down, but
Yeah, that would
make sense.
Right, it would make sense. So we're gonna do kind of a funky little zigzag on our tour tonight because we're trying to hit some good spots, and it has been a really, really busy night, and there's a lot of other groups, and I don't want us to be tripping over them, but that might amount to a little bit of zigzagging in weird spots. Is that okay with you guys?
That's
in terms of
fine.
we backtrack a little?
Sure.
All right, so let's roll this direction. I have several, like 3 or 4 different versions of my loop, and I walked a lot of them earlier, and they were all just weird groups and busy things and traffic happening. So we're getting a little creative so we can have a bit of a more peaceful tour. We're gonna come right back through here.
So this is mga government property.
Judicial center. So this is like a lot of the courts and the law related stuff. I don't know. I expect that one probably is because she's real old. But some of these are more modern. She's feeling modern. I don't know any specific stories about it. Well, that's new. We're putting in a little bar. This thing has been under construction. Was it really? I've been watching them like renovate this, and then I haven't brought a tour down this stretch for a minute. My favorite thing about this though is that it's identified as this building.
This building.
Most of them have the such and such.
Yeah, yeah.
They're like, we don't have a name for this guy, but we still want it to look like there's a title. This building, post-revolutionary period. So again,
1949.
it's very big. We're all very big. Yeah, all this is, look at that, it looks fancy. Cool, it also smells really good, which is a problem. Oh, you can't just go put in a really nice smelling restaurant right in the middle of my path. No, you don't want me here. All right. We're going to go over here and talk about this. So you guys stand over here at a pillar so that I can cross the way. Something I forgot to mention earlier is that I am not allowed to block the sidewalk with my groups. So that's why I kind of asked you guys to stand or sit somewhere in particular. I'm trying to make that we're out of the way. So I'm actually going to ask you to scooch back so that if anybody comes through, they come through the middle. I know it seems nitpicky, but if someone complains about me, I get an $1,100 fine, and I'm not messing around with that nonsense. They are strict about tourism rules. All right, so welcome to the home of Dr. David Ramsey from back in the early 1700s. I lied. Late 1700s, early 1800s, which sounded wrong when I wrote all that. Now, this story actually backs up a little bit. We're going to come to David, but we're going to start by talking about the Lorenz family. Are any of y'all Revolutionary War era buffs or maybe fans of the musical Hamilton? Okay. Do you remember John Lorenz in that musical? He's one of the main characters. In the early part during the war, he's one of the young men who's kind of a part of their group.
Okay.
So John was one of George Washington's aides de camp, one of his sort of 3 go-to guys, who were Alexander Hamilton, Lorenz, and Lafayette.
I see.
Now, sorry.
All right.
Oh, did you say something? So that is John. Now, this story is actually about his family and not him, but I just a lot of people have heard of him, so I wanted to, just in case, mention him. This story is about his father specifically. His father was Henry Lorenz, and Henry and his wife Martha Eleanor welcomed a brand new baby girl named Martha in 1760. like I said, I haven't taken anybody down this street for a little while, so bear with me while I get run. My stories are a little rusty. So brand new baby girl, and everything was perfectly fine. The mother was healthy, the baby was healthy, which honestly, November of 1760 is kind of, that's a win, starting off the bat, kind of doing awesome. But a few months later, we had an epidemic come sweeping through the city in the spring, and a lot of people got sick, and little baby Martha caught this fever that was going around. Now she's brand spanking new. She's like 3 or 4 months old, and she did not last very long. Unfortunately, she passed away. So her parents, of course, are heartbroken. This is, very, very sad, and they go ahead and start preparing for her funeral. Now, burial practices at the time worked a little bit differently than they do now, actually quite a bit differently than they do now. Nowadays, when someone dies, you have to have a medical professional sign off on them being dead, right? A doctor or a nurse, someone who knows what they're talking about. But historically, and when I say historically, we're talking about Charleston history, okay? So not ancient Egypt, but 16, 17, 1800s, European English culture. That makes sense? Yeah? So, that is what happens, is you'd have to have a medical professional sign off on them being dead now, but then you didn't have to. Nowadays, when someone passes away, it usually takes us a week or two to get to the funeral. You got to make arrangements, have the family fly in, that kind of thing. But historically, again, that was not the case. Usually the funeral was held the next day. You never wanted to hold a funeral at night, and less than 24 hours was considered a little bit shady. But more than 24 hours, and they're starting to smell, especially in this climate. I mean, it's a little chilly today, but usually it's hot and humid around here, and it's just a basic health and safety issue, getting bodies in the ground fairly quickly. Now, nowadays, and we kind of mentioned this back there, bodies are usually embalmed or possibly autopsied or cremated or something like this. Historically, that was not the case. We would wash them, dress them, and lay them out for the wake. Now, for an adult, they might go on like the kitchen table. For a child, top of a cabinet, or maybe in a window seat, something like this. And then you would invite friends and family around to pay their last respects overnight, and then the next day, you hold the funeral. So that way the grave can be dug, the cabinet, or the coffin can be made by the cabinet maker, all of that happens in time for the next day. So this is where we come back to Martha and her parents. Martha has been dressed in her little gown. She is very, very, very tiny and laid out in the window seat. And her friends, her family, her parents' friends and family have come around to pay their last respects. Now, one of their friends was a doctor. It was not Dr. Ramsey, but it was a doctor. And he came around, and he, on a hunch, decided to sort of examine little baby Martha very carefully. Now, there was a great fear of contagion at the time, and a limited understanding about how certain things worked. So he decides to kind of, he's feeling very brave. This is his friend's baby, so he decides to carefully examine her, and he actually finds just the tiniest signs of life. Now, I actually don't know what it was that he noticed that her parents didn't, but Martha was almost in a coma. She's borderline in a coma, and he managed to identify that she wasn't actually dead. So, of course, he tells her parents. They are overjoyed and not a little bit freaked out, right? I mean, is that a fair reaction? It's kind of how you would feel. They were this close to burying their daughter alive. Now, we tend to think of people being buried alive as sort of the stuff of horror movies, right? Like, this feels very sort of fantastical. It feels very sensational. But it was actually very common for all of those reasons that we just talked about. And when you start to kind of break it down, that makes sense. Like, if you don't know what a coma is, and there's no doctor involved, and you've given them like 24 hours, you start to see how people were slipping through those cracks there. I was actually recently reading an article and by some historians who specialize in this area, specifically dealing with people being buried alive, and they think it could have been as many as 1 in 25 people, which honestly, I think might be kind of low for a number.
But that's why they call it the wake, is because they're like technically waiting for that person to like wake up.
Yeah, but think about a coma. Think about how long you can be in a coma.
I know.
But yes, that's one of the things. It's not just waiting for them to wake up. It's also you stay awake. Usually it's all night, and there's different terminologies. But yeah, I mean they were, and this is the thing. They weren't unaware of this concept. They knew it was happening at the time. They didn't know how to prevent it without just waiting for the body to rot, or themselves stabbing it or something, right? Like they're doing their best. They're aware of the problem.
Yes.
They don't know how to fix it. And So like I said, as many as 1 in 25 people they think this could have happened to, which is a little bit creepy. Let's be honest, that's not ideal. Martha, though, is in the clear. Martha, they have figured out she's still alive. Her parents are thrilled. They call off the funeral, they call off the grave, all of that. But this is not an experience that you easily forget, okay? Martha herself actually went on to grow up, and she married Dr. David Ramsey. They had kids, lived a whole full life. She actually was a really fascinating woman. She kept a journal all during the American Revolution. She actually spent time both in England and here. And her husband outlived her. And I just want to say, my one beef with Dr. Ramsey is that he published her personal diaries like, I think it was like 9 weeks after she died. So gentlemen, just, pro tip, if your wife dies, give it a little more time before you publish her diary, okay? Because she names names. But it's actually a very important historic document. So the fact that we have it because of her experiences is kind of cool. But I'm like, dude, come on. It's too soon. That's not nice. So otherwise, he's a pretty cool guy. So that is Martha, and that's how Dr. David comes into our story here. And this was the house that they lived in for a while. Now, that's the story about Martha. She, like I said, happy ending, it's all good. Her parents, though, have to live with this situation that happened. Her mom seems to have handled it pretty well and kind of moved on, but her dad never really got over this. Henry developed a serious fear of being buried alive, and he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how he could guarantee that this would never happen to him. Problem is, once you're dead, or at least they think you're dead, it's really not up to you anymore, is it? There's only so much you can do. And they didn't really do very many other types of burial practices at the time. It was pretty straightforward. But he spends the rest of his life trying to, come up with a plan here. And he finally decides he would rather burn alive than be buried alive. And so he wants to be cremated. But, like I said, cremation was not a thing in European culture at the time. It just wasn't how they did things. They considered it very ancient and pagan and sort of vaguely associated with hellfire and generally unhygienic. So it was not what they liked to do. But Henry is determined. So he ends up talking one of his sons into taking on the responsibility of burning him. It's not great. It's not a great conversation to have, right? Finally, he talks his son into it. And years later, Henry passes away. Now, as far as we know, he was well and truly dead. So it's fine, okay? And the time has come for his son to fulfill his promise to his father. So he goes down by the river on their plantation. None of the rest of the family would help. Martha herself, in her letter, she called it the awful ceremony and refused to attend. They all thought this was totally creepy and ridiculous. But he gets a few of their enslaved workers to come and help him. So they go down and they're going to cremate Henry. The thing is, cremation is a lot more of a science than we really think it is. It seems like it's an easy thing to do. It's actually not that easy. You have to get the fire to a certain temperature, you need to burn for a certain length of time, and it's just, it's a little bit of a challenge. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't have a cremation, you have a barbecue. This was amateur hour. So you've got Henry and a few of their slaves building a pyre down by the river, or also Henry, his son, and they lay Henry out. And then they're a little bit concerned that he might not burn properly because it's very humid, it's very wet, it's not great. And they're like, so they end up stuffing his pockets full of kindling, and they soak him down with creosote, which is kind of like an old-fashioned lighter fluid, and then they light him up. At this point, they've gone a little too far the wrong direction. So Henry goes up like a dried-out Christmas tree. I mean, he just goes right on there. However, he's not burning at a nice even temperature. He's not burning at the right kind of pace. So he starts burning through at some of the skinny bits a little bit out of order. And he ends up burning through at the neck before some of his, meatier areas. And his neck burns through and his head pops off. His head, which is on fire, pops off. It goes rolling down off the pyre, heading for the river. Fortunately, one of the slaves was really quick on his feet. He ran down there, he caught that before it hit the river, and he punted it back up onto the pyre, and he did eventually burn all the way through, just not laid out with any kind of dignity or like anatomical normalcy at this stage. So, now, I think you can count this as a happy ending for Henry, right? Because really all he wanted was to not be buried alive. So even though this happened, he's fine, he's dead, he's gone, he got what he wanted, it's all good. However, the story about this got out. This is a true story. I'm not making this up. Somebody who was there loud. And to be honest, if I was there for the Flaming Head incident, I would have told everyone I know. Like, I wasn't there, and I'm still telling everyone I know about the Flaming Head incident. And word about this gets out around Charleston. Now, Henry Lorenz was a big deal. He'd been like the governor and all of these things, and so he is, very high-end citizen of Charleston. And so the powers that be get together and decide to outlaw cremation formally in Charleston for about the next 100 years. So, happy ending for Charleston. Now that is our little Lorenz family loop. And I just want you guys to know, not everything that ever happened in the Lorenz family was like people being buried alive and flaming heads and all of this. There were a lot of more normal things that happened as well, but we're hitting on quite a few of these tonight. And it's not quite over yet. This is now David Ramsey. We're going to come back to him really quickly. Dr. Ramsey, like I said, outlived his wife. And then he ended up living and working here. At one point in the very, very early 18 teens, there was a man in town. He was a tailor, and he was on trial upon various charges in front of the courts. But at some point in the court proceedings, he snapped and tried to murder his attorney. Not the other person's attorney, but his attorney, which is just a little bit questionable, right? Like, where's that coming from? And so the powers that be realized that there might be something not quite right with this guy, and he was actually really not quite right mentally. So they come to Dr. David Ramsey, who wasn't just a doctor in the sense of a physician, he was also essentially a psychiatrist at the time.
Yes.
And they ask him to examine this man, see if he can, reasonably stand trial, and he does. And he comes to the conclusion that this man is not reasonably able to stand trial. He is, in Dr. Ramsey's words, a proper lunatic, which was a diagnosis at the time. And he recommends that this man be basically put in an asylum, which, let's be honest, mental asylum's never a place you want to be, especially in the early 1800s, right? This is not a good situation. But he did try to murder his attorney, and he was already up on violent charges, so I mean, yeah. So this is what happens to this guy. They put him in the asylum for a few years, and after a little while, they decide he's cured, and they release him. And he immediately goes out and finds a pistol and comes looking for Dr. David Ramsey. And he finds him just a couple buildings down from his house. He's on his way home. He's walking along on the street. This man pops up out of nowhere, shoots him. Oh, no, you're fine. We're leaving you a gap so you can walk through. You don't have to go on the road. You're good. And shoots him in the side and in the leg and takes off running. Now, immediately a crowd comes rushing over. The doctor's on the ground. He's bleeding. They all pick him up, and they manage to get him into his house, and they're trying to help. These are both really bad gunshot wounds. There's not a lot that you can do, especially at the time. And so he ends up bleeding out, passing away. Some of his last words, as he's laying here in the middle of this crowd, rushing out, trying to help, trying to do anything that they can, he actually called for them all to be quiet, and he charged them to bear witness that the man who perpetrated this deed was a lunatic and free from guilt. And I just find that fascinating and really cool that Dr. Ramsey really and truly was a physician to the very end, and he used his last words to try and save his murderer from being hanged for his murder. Just kind of cool. So, that being said, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
So what's inside now? What the
I don't
purpose?
have any ghosts about this one. This one, I think,
So,
I'm honestly not sure what is currently in here. I don't think it's a house, otherwise we wouldn't be standing here.
Yeah.
But I do, there is
commercial.
I do see kids coming and going. Sorry?
It's a commercial.
Is it what?
Commercial now.
Oh, is it commercial? I think so, 100% based on the fact that there's an exit sign in there. And they have like digital locks on some of the doors. I think it's office space.
Oh, I
But
see.
I've never actually found out exactly what it is. But they have like a little lobby area, and so I do see folks coming and going in the evenings, and I can't tell if it's like parents and kids, of maybe like one of the parents works there, but I just don't know. I'm sorry. I don't think it's a house. If I find out that it's a house and I've been standing groups in front of it, I'm gonna feel really, really guilty about it.
So what happened to the guy who killed him?
I don't know. I don't know if they caught him. I've never been able to find that information. I kind of like it. Oh, actually, sir, please don't fill this little box though, just in case.
Oh, okay, sorry.
If we go anywhere where you can film in the windows, I'll
All right.
A lot of these are. So, I don't know what I hope happens, to be honest. I mean, on the one hand, the guy was clearly pretty violent, and so I don't know that him being out and loose is good. On the other hand, I think if they caught him, they probably would have hanged him.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily like that idea. But if they did catch him and put him in an asylum, I would feel bad about that too. But that's not a, it's really not a win for this guy.
No good outcome.
Yeah, now that you've committed murder, there's not a great outcome. Oh. So is this your first time in Charleston?
Yes, ma'am.
How's it going? You like it?
Yeah, I mean this historic tour. I mean the historic district.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very unique neighborhood. We've been talking about that.
It looks like small Europe.
It does look like small Europe. And you know, it was funny. Right after the pandemic, everybody
Yes.
we had a lot of people coming here saying that they had like booked a trip to Europe and couldn't go now, so they
they
came
went to
here
Charleston?
instead. Yep.
That's
Which
funny.
makes sense to me. It's just I want to do it. He's back in there. You can film if you want to. And let me pull my thing out. 1 second. What do you see in the tree? Somebody going.
Oh yeah.
That is a hanging pirate in the tree. And he looks, sometimes I think he's climbing a rope, sometimes I think he's hanged. It's not real clear, and it's always facing the other direction. This building is currently a law firm. I don't know why they have a pirate hanging in the tree. He's been there for years. And I forget about him every summer because that tree fills in and you can't see anything but the feet. And then this time of year, I'm always like, there's a pirate in the tree, and he's still there. And he's been chugging along for like 7 or 8 years now. I don't know how long, but it's been at least 7 or 8 years. So, we're going to talk about someone likes pirates, and someone at the law firm has it. One or the other. They've got a sense of humor over here. So we are going to actually pop back across the streets. So we take advantage of that bench, and then I'm going to tell you a story about this house. Let's go on. We're talking about all the crazy drivers and that stuff.
But there are no people coming, so
Yeah, exactly. Like, I just feel like I'm sorry for that person. Here, guys. If you want to sit, you're more than welcome to. You don't have to, obviously. You don't always have to. All right, so that house right there, that is called the John Lining House. And he was not the man who built it, but he was one of the earlier residents of that house. And we've dated it back to about 1711, which is pretty impressive for a little wooden house, right?
yeah, that's really old.
And that is from a sale. It's not from the building of the house, so it probably is even a little bit older. My favorite era favorite story from this house's history, and there's a lot of stories, happened in 1867. And that year, we had a really weird storm in Charleston. Now, that should catch your attention because normal weather in Charleston includes hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, fires. I'm counting that as weather. Just like everything happens in Charleston. We actually have blizzards more often than we have this kind of storm I'm about to talk about. This year, 1867, it was rain. Just insane amounts of rain. Now, we get a lot of rain already, but this was rain that didn't stop, didn't pause, just kept coming, Noah's Ark style, for weeks. Now, that might not sound like a very big deal because Charleston deals with a lot of water regularly. But we are built for water and floods that come and go. Hurricane rain, tidal floods, things like this. So we get a ton of water and then it goes away. But rain that just doesn't stop has nowhere to go. We are currently on the highest elevation street in town. King Street here used to be the King's Highway. It was the main trade route that connected all the English colonies up and down the East Coast. And it went from our front city gates that were just between this and the intersection where we started out, all the way up to Boston, Massachusetts at the other end. And here on the peninsula, it sits on the natural spine, the natural high ground. And we're currently sitting at a whopping 12 feet above sea level. Very high elevation, right? The lowest elevation street in town, a couple blocks that direction, is 3 feet below sea level. 2 more blocks and you're sitting in the water. So we're very, very low sitting. Now, this storm, this rain that just rained and rained and rained, we actually had a storm very similar to that in 2014. And it flooded the state. It broke through dams. It reversed the flow of rivers. There were literally alligators swimming in the street in the neighborhood across the street from me. They turned the waters back around and they headed inland and took out Columbia as well as flooding Charleston. They called it, they being the meteorologists of today, a 1,000-year rain event, meaning that's how often that kind of rain should hit where we live. They forgot that in 1867, which is not quite 1,000 years ago, they had a very similar storm. So I know it doesn't sound like much, but you got to understand the effect that that has. I read an eyewitness account from this storm about a week in, and this woman said that from her house, everything she could see, and she was down here on the peninsula, was 2 feet deep in water. There were rats climbing up the sides of buildings and dead dogs floating in the street, and the whole city is just very slowly drowning with no end in sight. So that's what's happening in 1867, and that's the backdrop to this story, okay? Now, in the middle of this storm, when it's already flooding, it's already getting kind of rough, we're actually moving towards the end of this storm, there is a woman who comes out on a street corner, and at one night she starts preaching that she knows what's making it rain, and more importantly, she knows how to make it stop. And she pretty soon gathers a whole crowd, so much so that she's causing a little bit of a disruption. The police come out, they arrest her, and they keep her in prison overnight for disturbing the peace. The next morning they let her go, and they're like, look, everyone's already freaked out, go home. And she's like, yes, sir. She goes right back out, starts preaching it again. Now, do you know what she was telling them? She was telling them that there was a mermaid trapped somewhere on the peninsula, and that if we did not find her and release her to the sea, she was going to drown us all.
Oh, dears.
Okay. Now, a couple of things you need to know about this. First of all, this woman was a Gullah lady. Have you guys heard the term Gullah since you've been in town? Yeah, G-U-L-L-A-H. It's the word applies to the people group, the language, and the culture. They are the descendants of the kidnapped and enslaved West Africans here in the Low Country. So culturally, it's a blend of West African culture, Low Country culture, a little bit of Christianity thrown in to kind of spice everything up. So you gotta, to be fair, there's a very strong mythology and belief system attached to her culture. And for them, mermaids are a very serious practical problem, which, who among us has not had a problem dealing with a mermaid at some point, right? So she starts preaching yet again that there is a mermaid trapped somewhere in the city. And pretty soon, she has a mob that she has collected. They said she had about 500 people. And, which honestly, you've seen the size of our streets. I don't know that you could fit 500 people on a street corner, but apparently it was a lot of people. And she now has a mermaid hunting mob, and they end up striking out through the city to go hunting for this mermaid. Now, at the time, this building was the home of Dr. Trott's apothecary, Dr. William Trott. He was a doctor. He was an apothecary, which was the word for a pharmacist or pharmacy at the time. He was also a naturalist. Now, naturalists, this is sort of a realm of the field sciences where, today we would call them a field scientist, right? But back in the day, these are the guys who have like the bugs pinned to boards and the weird little collections. And let's be honest, it's a little bit creepy, right? It's like the 2-headed snake and formaldehyde in a jar. These are the kind of guys who have specimens. And he did. He had a number of creepy things. He had a mummified frog, pretty famously. Everyone was freaked out by his mummified frog. And he liked to display his specimens around his pharmacy as sort of, educational conversation starters, which his customers found mostly creepy, let's be honest. And so now we've got a mermaid hunting mob out and about, and they are out all day. No luck. They can't find the mermaid. And then later in the day, they're wet. They've been out here in the rain. It's disgusting. It's cold. It's not going well. And one of them starts to think, this doesn't make any sense. There's so much water everywhere. If she's in here. How can she possibly still be trapped? And then somebody else goes, oh my gosh, we should have thought of this sooner. You know Dr. Trott, he likes to keep things in jars. I bet you he's got her. That's what I'm talking about. That's a residential neighborhood he's heading into with kids and cats. I was complaining about the drivers earlier that are driving really unsafe. Anyway, and the whole mob goes, you know what, that makes complete sense. And they turn and they march on Dr. Trott's apothecary. Now, they show up and he comes out to say hello, which is kind of a crazy move to me. Like, you have a mob that turns up on your doorstep in the rain and they're clearly mad. Do you come out to say hello? Yeah. But he does. He comes out and he's like, what can I do for you folks? And they're like, release the mermaid! And he's like, sorry, what? But he could not convince them he didn't have a mermaid in a jar. So he ends up flagging down a friend who brings out the cops. They come out and they're like, all right, what seems to be the problem? And so all the people tell him, he's got a mermaid in the jar. We're all going to die. This is what's happening. And the sheriff says, well, let me talk to him. He goes inside. He talks to Dr. Trott for a few minutes. He comes back out and he tells them it's taken care of. You can all go home. And we do not know what was said, but they trust him. They either trust him or at least they respect his authority, and they do. They disperse. And within 2 days, the rain stops. So, make of that what you will. But honestly, this isn't really a morbid story. There's no ghosts, there's no murders, but it is my favorite story in Charleston, and I just needed to tell you guys this. They called this the Charleston Mermaid Riot. You can look up the original newspaper articles about the Charleston Mermaid Riot, and it is... And I mean, do any of you live in a city where they had a mermaid riot?
We don't.
See? Don't you kind of wish you did? I think it's pretty awesome. All right, let's go ahead and roll. You have a mermaid riot at your disposal. You just have to take it.
Yeah. I guess so.
Right. What's your land? I thought about it before. Now I do.
Maybe we're about to start something, right?
There you go. Motivate the movement, right?
I mean, there is the live action movie.
There's Little Mermaid. There's a live action movie.
It could be a kid riot.
Yeah.
Preservation laws.
Yeah.
This is what we were talking about earlier, and you can see some more details here. Now, you guys probably saw this, but my favorite Quaker, I never thought I'd have a favorite Quaker, sorry. My favorite here is Mary Fisher Bailey Cross. She is fascinating to me. You can see here, she had a whole bunch of wild and crazy adventures. She became a missionary and ended up going to the Ottoman Empire, as you can see, in 1660. So that's Turkey.
That's like pretty far away.
She's a single, young, Quaker, very religious English woman in Turkey in the 1660s. And while she's there, she gets summoned before the Sultan and uses the opportunity to preach at him, which is kind of awesome. And he's like, you know what? You're gutsy. I like it. Awesome. And they had a perfectly respectful relationship the rest of the time she was there. And when she came back, that wasn't enough adventure for her. So she ends up joining this new colony heading over here to the Americas with the rest of the Quakers. And while she was here, she married several times and kept outliving her husbands. So that's why she has a million last names. But they called her, you can see there, She Who Spake with the Great Turk, which is the coolest nickname I have ever heard in my life, right? And you can just see them being like, you know, Mr. Cross and your wife, She Who Spake to the Great Turk, which is such a cool nickname, and I love her.
Spake.
She's fake.
Fake. She's fake too. Big. I mean, I think the Hall's a great church also. Yeah. You must be getting some really cool footage. My camera won't pick this kind of stuff up, but it'll just get some good shots in the dark. Coogan's Porch yet? Lots of stories about Coogan's Porch. This is generally considered the most haunted restaurant in town. Are you planning on going to Coogan's, or are you tangled up?
I might be now.
You look a little stuck.
I love it.
Well, lots of different stories about this place. My personal favorite is the story of Coogan himself. Now, this building was actually in the 1800s, and it was bought by a woman named Bobby Ball back in the 1970s. And she just wanted to turn it into a restaurant. And when she did, there was a local gentleman who came around and introduced himself. His name was Coogan, and they ended up falling in love. And I'm telling you, this was a romance for the ages. A restaurant after him, and he spent the rest of his life, when the restaurant was open, he'd hang out on the front porch and greet visitors as they came and went. And when he did eventually pass away, she had him buried in the front yard. Now, if you look over here at this mural, first of all, the light ironically makes it a lot harder to see than we have that light there.
That him on the left?
That's not him. That's
Okay. Okay.
So this painting is actually based on a classical painting. The mural is painted out based on a classical painting. And I suspect that everyone in this is based on a real life regular from the early days of the restaurant. I actually haven't asked them to confirm that because I don't want them to tell me I know. No, I just think that's great. I do know for a fact, though, that Coogan and Bobby are featured in this mural. Okay? The real life Coogan and Bobby. So a while ago, I started my groups if they wanted to speculate as to who Coogan and Bobby were. And it's not meant to be a trick question or a competition or anything, but I found that you guys see so many different interesting dynamics, relationships, and stories. Like, people are just like, well, you can tell how these two were having an affair and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, wow. So I really enjoyed we're going to back right on up here. But what do you guys think? Anybody want to venture a guess as to who Coogan and Bobby might be?
I think maybe the blonde lady in the blue.
Here? Oh, up there in the middle.
Yeah, in the middle.
Okay.
And maybe, but now that I think about it, maybe the man in the bowler hat is Coogan. And then Bobby is the lady who's looking longingly
Looking longingly.
at it.
Okay. Okay. I'm not going to tell you until everybody has a chance, but anyone's supposed to guess.
I would say Coogan's down there front.
Okay.
With his chair turned around. So he's telling
He
stories.
looks like a local kind of guy, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He's telling a story.
What about Bobby?
I think Bobby is the lady that's kind of
Looking at him. What about you? What do you think?
The same guess.
Same. That's a popular pair because like
Yeah,
you've got that
they're in
vibe,
the-
right? A lot of
they're-
people think that Coogan is the guy with the top hat in the back because
Yeah.
he just looks like the kind of guy who'd have a weird name and would sort of
Yeah.
like move into your house randomly, right? So many different stories, and I actually put a lot of thought into it, and I realized, at least my theory, as to why we see so many different things here, is if you look closely, and it's hard to tell in this darkness, none of them are looking at each other, okay? So she's looking at him, but he's looking off into the distance. She's looking at him, he's looking at us. He's looking at her, she's looking at him. It's all like one way, so it creates really interesting dynamics. There's actually only one pair in this painting, and again, I know it's a little hard to see, but there's only one pair that are well and truly staring deeply into each other's eyes, and that is the real life Coogan and Bobby.
Oh,
And they're right down here in the bottom left-hand corner. Bobby is the woman in the black shirt, and Coogan is the little fluffy white dog. But I mean, look at that. Look at the way they're looking at each other. Tell me
love.
that's not a romance for the ages.
True love.
I mean, come on. Story's true though. He was a little stray, lived in the neighborhood. He came around and they met and they fell in love, and she adopted him. And she named her restaurant after him. You really have to love someone to name a restaurant Coogan's. Okay?
I think it's a cool name.
Right? Okay. It's not your name.
No, it's not.
Okay, good. I was
But
like,
that would be cool. I'd be like,
Yeah.
this is actually my restaurant.
my restaurant. So he used to hang out on the porch all the time, and he would greet visitors when they came and went. She has several restaurants now. They're all Coogan, something or other. And when he passed away, she did bury him in the front yard. And he does allegedly haunt the place. He licks ankles under the tables. He steals biscuits. It's the cutest haunting we have. Now, there are a lot of different stories that go on here. Most of them are things like the waiter's like, oh, and then the tray flew out of my hand, and oh, I heard a knocking on the wall. And it's not like a whole story necessarily. But if you come and you eat, ask your servers, because they all have that one time that I heard a weird thing, or the fan did something funky, or they've all got those kind of stories. We, however, like I said, we're seeing my favorite. We're gonna come over here and say hello to Putin.
Does he have like a plaque?
We have a whole gravy stone.
Oh.
So fun.
Pugans.
On that side, it's easier to see. And there he is.
Oh yeah.
Oh boy.
Oh.
Oh, darn it, Jim. Oh, I'm so ashamed of myself. Oh, I had a little girl on one of my on one of my history tours today ask me if we had any memorials in the city to a special dog. And I was so taken aback by that question, because
1979.
right? And I was like, I can't think of any. And I asked several other people, can you think of any memorials to a special dog? And I did not think of Pugin. I should have thought of Pugin.
Spirit was speaking to her.
I'm ashamed of myself. This just looks so terrible. And you know what? We were even on this tour. We even passed right by here.
Right, Pugan. Yeah.
If you want to sit in the windowsills, they're kind of a perfect bar stool height. Just please don't put your feet up on the wall, because it leaves scuff marks, and I discovered that the hard way. All right, welcome to the Mills House Hotel. One of the fancy historic hotels in town. Yes, I'm sure that's an architect. Originally completed in 1853, and it was standing here at the time of the Great Fire in 1860. I mentioned that earlier, talking about the meeting house, right? And we actually just went down the street where the fire went. But I want to tell you a little bit about how it affected this building. Now, a great fire is not nearly as fun as it sounds. It is a fire that burns more than 100 buildings. And it had which is ridiculous, right? Did we talk about that part earlier?
Yeah, there were a lot. We know there were a lot.
Yeah, quite a few. Absolutely insane. Now, the last and arguably the most devastating of them all was the Great Fire of 1861. Now, a lot of people hear 1861, Charleston fire, they assume this had to do with the Civil War, right? Because it started here in that year. But as far as we can tell, that's not actually the case. They actually think it was a cooking fire over on the harbor, over on the Cooper River side, that got out of hand. And the wind that night was very strong, cold wind. It was a cold front blowing down the East Coast. So it was opposite to our normal directions. Usually our wind comes out of the south and out of the west, but it was heading the opposite way. So it drove the fire on a diagonal across the city, and in one fell swoop it burned over 600 buildings, killed hundreds of people, and took out somewhere between a third and a half of the city. Really bad night in Charleston's history. So I want you to picture the scene right now. If you look up from this intersection, okay, everything that you can see from where we're standing north of that intersection was in flames. All of it. All of that since the Great Fire. They had a bucket brigade running down this street here. This is Queen, and we're only a few blocks off the water, heading like this. So everybody's running like mad. We had no proper fire department at the time, so the flames are hot, the wind is cold, the smoke is everywhere, and it's a madhouse. And right in the middle of all this chaos is the Mills House Hotel. And it is full of people, and they do not have entrances and exits like fire exits the way we do now. So they can't get them out fast enough. Now, At the time, you saw how long this hotel was as we were coming up the side, right? That was not the case at the time. This was only about 3 rooms-ish deep. It just wasn't, this was the long side, and it went 3 or 4 rooms that way. That was the short side. So we actually know that they were taking women and children out through the coal cellar at the back. Just, another exit to get people out. And I just want to point this out because it kind of hit me. You don't drag your babies through coal dust heading into a city in flames if you have any better option, right? So that's what's going on here. Now the people still in the hotel are desperately trying to protect the building, and they're desperately trying to protect themselves.
A horse, the dog.
It's so much fun. One time, a family bring a baby, puppy, golden retriever on my tour.
That's cute.
We did nothing but people stopping to pet the dog. It was great. We loved it. We were all it's like 2 ghost stories and a lot of petting the dog. So they were trying to protect the building, and they were using a very particular methodology. They were hanging blankets and linens out of the windows, draping them down the outside of the building, and soaking them down with water. Again, bucket brigade. Functionally, they were creating a wet blanket barrier around the outside of the building, which is actually kind of clever, right? You're going to steam off a little bit of heat. You're going to protect it from at least some sparks. But does that sound like it'll hold up to a great fire? No, not really. First time I heard that, I was like, there's no way that's going to work. But you know what? It's actually kind of interesting. The fire made its way down here. It gets to this intersection, and it catches that strong wind, that cross breeze coming off the water. And it turns the direction of the fire and sends it really fast down Queen Street instead. So that means that it passed by the short side of the hotel rather than the long side. That, combined with the wet blanket barrier, actually protected the building. So it did scorch that side of it, but it did not burn it down.
Interesting.
Against all odds, unlike virtually everything else around this section, the Mills House Hotel survived the Great Fire of 1861. It did not, however, survive the Great Termite Debacle of the 1960s. This is a replica of the original from the 1970s. Here we go. Now, all that at the back, that's an extension. All the inside's been rearranged, but this front facade is almost identical to the original hotel. They added a couple floors, but otherwise, this is basically what it looked like. You would recognize a photo of the original hotel. Now, people staying here often have a very interesting experience, and I consider this to be sort of a stamp of approval on the hotel, okay? The new hotel, as it were. People staying here will wake up in the middle of the night to this crazy commotion out in the hallway. Shouting voices, running feet, slamming doors. But when they stick their heads out to be like, knock it off! It's quiet, it's empty, there's nothing going on. So, many people believe that what's being experienced here is something called a residual haunting. Now, the idea behind a residual haunting is that it's spirits caught in a loop. They're not haunting you, per se. They don't even know that you're there. They're just living a traumatic or personally significant moment over and over and over, like a record stuck on a skip.
So they're like running from the fire?
It even sounds like they're fighting the fire, like they're running around in circles, setting up that blanket barrier, and it's just people still stuck in that really terrifying moment where they're very, very desperate. So that is what is experienced here, and it happens so often. It's kind of a thing in Charleston. Like, people just kind of know. You stay at the Mills House, you might have this. You guys staying at the Mills House Hotel?
Yeah.
Okay, good times. Good times. Well, you're gonna love this next part of the story. So a few years ago, my friend Stephanie was a carriage tour driver like me. Now, she was driving one of the little tiny private carriages during the day.
Yeah.
Not the big, mini buses, but the little fancy ones. And she had a husband and wife and a teenage daughter. That's who she's got in her carriage. Now, we have assigned routes, so I know exactly what they were doing. They're coming down, meeting straight here, and going to turn down Queen. It's actually the same path as the fire, coincidentally. So as she's coming down, she starts telling them about the hotel and the architecture and the fire and the war and all the good stuff, all the history that we talk about. But she gets held up at the light. There's a weird little traffic moment, and it kind of, slows her down. So by the time she's actually turning through the intersection, she's pretty much finished what she would normally talk about. So she decides, to throw in a little something extra, which as tour guides, you're always kind of judging your timing, right? So she decides to tell them the ghost story. This is springtime, first thing in the morning, broad daylight. She throws out the ghost story. partway through, the daughter leans over, smacks her mom in the arm, and goes, "You wouldn't believe me last night." Guess who was staying at the Mills House Hotel? So it turns out, all night long, the daughter kept having this experience. She keeps waking up to these crazy noises in the home. She keeps waking her parents up because she thinks there's an emergency happening.
Yeah.
Her parents don't hear anything. So while she's listening to it, they're looking her in the eye and telling her, "There's nothing going on. You're dreaming. Go back to sleep." All night long. So come the next morning, none of them have slept enough. Everybody's a little frazzled. Everybody's a little bit on edge. And her parents are like, "You know what? It's okay. We're going to get our vacation back on track. We're going to take a nice, picturesque carriage ride. It'll be, we'll spring for the private. It'll be extra peaceful. It'll take her mind off things, right?"
Yeah.
Right out of the gate, Stephanie hits him with an unprovoked ghost story. Right out of the gate. This is 2 blocks into the route. And now, Stephanie has a hysterical teenager in her carriage. This girl is crying. Her parents are furious. They feel that it's inappropriate. The hotel did not warn them that it could potentially be haunted when they made their booking. Did they warn you that it could be haunted when you made your booking?
No.
Has any hotel ever warned you that it could be haunted when you made your booking? We still would have booked.
Loved it.
Good answer. So the parents have got their phones out trying to find somewhere else to stay. But it's springtime. It's the height of visitor season.
Yeah.
Everything's booked. So they're getting increasingly frustrated. So as they're actually heading down the street here, and you saw how long it is now,
Yeah.
you've got staff coming and going, guests, other tour groups, people who know Stephanie, like we're all in the industry here. And she's driving along with a bawling teenager and 2 parents who are ranting about, "Well, we're not staying here another night. So inappropriate. Rah, rah, rah." And she's just driving along like,
Yeah.
"Hi, sorry," the whole way down. By the time she made it back to the barn, she was permanently traumatized. Being the good, supportive friend that I am, I tell everyone, I think this is hilarious, okay? And this is the only one of our stories tonight, probably, that's gonna have a moral of the story, and it has 2. Number 1, don't tell people ghost stories in the daytime if they didn't ask you for them, right? And number 2, if you're staying in a historic hotel in Charleston,
Yeah.
or any old city, just go ahead and assume somebody died. I guarantee
Yes.
you somebody died there, right?
It's
Somebody
a dark
could be getting
secret.
hung. Exactly. It could be you. Just start there. The whole thing's less dramatic. That being said, you guys are staying here. Are you staying at the Battery Carriage House Inn by any chance?
No, I stay in the shipyard
Then you're
area.
fine. You don't need to worry about it. As long as you're on the Battery Carriage House Inn, we're all good. All right, let's keep rolling.
Like, she should feel flattered because the streets are busy. It's kind of like that aura.
There you go.
That's true, though.
Of losing broadly and then stumbling in the middle of an experience and an unexpected ghost tour. And
I would be like,
if someone made my teenagers cry out of nowhere, I'd be like,
In the hallway, they're not like in your room.
yeah, they're not like, I guess that's the thing.
I'd be like, okay, well,
super aggressive.
Yeah,
Which is
I
fair.
mean,
I just feel like their parents reacted that way. It cracks me up. I'm like,
they weren't just like, okay, well.
Stephanie just came back, so like, I told them about the ghost story and I shouldn't have. And what happened? She's like, "Well, they're staying there and they did that all that." I was like, right, yeah. All right, what I said about lots of groups.
yeah.
Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna kind of tuck in here because I'm gonna tuck in towards the graveyard, but I don't want to shout over him. So if you want to be here,
Okay.
and we're gonna just this way. Me okay from here?
Yes.
All right. So this church, this is the Circular Congregational Church, and it's built on the site of the Old White Meeting House. Now, the Old White Meeting House was a wooden building painted white, lest there be any confusion about the name, and it was a shared house of worship for everybody who wasn't Church of England. So if you didn't go to St. Philip's, over there, that steeple, that's the Church of England, you went here. It's actually the reason that this is called Meeting Street. It used to be Meeting House Street. Now, unfortunately, the old white meeting house burned down. So they built the new white meeting house, which then burned down. So they built the first circular congregational church, and then it burned down. This is the second circular congregational church. It has never burned down. Be honest, who's a little surprised? Oh, come on.
Believable.
The last one was brick too, by the way. So this one was built in 1890, around the same time as we got our first proper fire department.
Oh,
That,
wow,
my
better late
friends,
than never.
that makes the difference.
They're like 5 fires later, we figured out that we need this.
See, here's the thing. Benjamin Franklin came here in the late 1700s, and he was like, you know what you guys need? It's a cool new idea. I called them fire departments. And we were like, Ben, we don't need that. We needed that. So the thing is that this graveyard is the original graveyard from the original meeting house. So even though the church is only about 130 years old, the graveyard goes all the way back to the 1680s. And the oldest grave in town that we've been able to date. Now, please understand me, I'm confident there are bodies in the ground since before this, right? But the oldest datable grave is right ahead of us. So you see the little ironwork section here, then you see the palmettos, then behind that there's another plot, back where that group is talking. And you see a bunch of gravestones in there that look like perfectly normal gravestones of varying kinds. Then, kind of on this side, kind of in the middle-ish, kind of towards the back, there is a large, rounded brick structure that looks, honestly, like a pizza oven. See what I'm talking about? Cross-fitted pizza oven and a tornado shelter. Yep. Yeah. That is the Simmons family grave. And they have found there are 4 members of the family inside, and they've dated it to 1693.
Wow.
So it's pretty cool. You can't come by the oldest graveyard in town and not, take a moment to appreciate it on a haunted tour. So as you can see, there's actually some specialty tours that you can book that just do the graveyards. That's all they do. They only do, I think, this one and like one other section. If you're interested in those, let me know. But we are graveyard from the other side. This is one of the cutest graveyards. So during the day, if the gates are open, and by during the day, that means before it gets dark or before 6 p.m., whatever gets first. That is open for visitors.
These were crazy. They had like
A little garden grave.
yeah, the garden grave. Never seen that before. Yeah, one got a little rose bush.
Yeah, there was a rose bush in there, but some of the headstones too have spooky skulls on them, and are they kind of look like they would be haunted.
Look like they're not. It's a very old graveyard. And we're not super accustomed to old graveyards in America. Depending on when you're from. But
I guess it's relative.
they're not as common. Yeah, across the U.S. on the whole.
Yeah.
So much of a country was settled later. So good for you. I don't want to make her feel intruded on or pressured. I don't want to kind of get in her way. But I want you guys to have a chance to look. So I'm going to step back here and we're going to kind of jog on around in a minute. We're going to go to our last spot. But I want you guys to get a chance to come in here if you want to take a picture or whatever. Please no flash since she's got a group going on.
Yeah.
If you want to come over here and just have a look, I'm going to stay back so I don't intrude because she knows I'm a guide. Okay? But feel free and I'll be right here and then.
Okay.
So we have to keep in mind that she was gravely ill, so there's no way for her to she made it in there. For all we know is that she had 2 lights down and died upstairs. So just for your own context, it is important for you to know that this was after the time of dead ringers, Saved by the Bell. We were fully aware for a long time that we were burying people. We weren't doing it on purpose, but we did know that it was going to happen. So we were trying to,
Safety coffins. It's a next thing we're going to talk about.
That's what
Some
I
of what
called dead
she's
ringer.
which is I'm gonna argue with you about safety coffins. That's the next thing we're going to talk about. And it often gets cited as the origin of dead ringer, Saved by the Bell, graveyard shift, all of that, which I got really excited about when I learned about it. Because I was an English major and I got all excited about, like, I love the origin
like,
of words and phrases,
fun.
right? I'm like, that's awesome. So I did some digging. Turns out that the safety coffins were real, and we'll talk about those. And the bell system was real.
Yeah.
But all those phrases have origins in other things. And there was a chain email. Do you guys remember chain emails?
Yes, where it's like
Yes.
forward or like Bloody Mary. Is
Yes,
gonna show
exactly.
Up, like.
There was a chain email in the 1990s that talked about safety coffins, and it's the origin of that being like, this is where that started. And so the email cited all those things as being,
Interesting.
and that's like as far back as I've been able to trace it. So you can actually find those phrases in other things. But their connection to safety coffins is from the 90s.
Man, fun times.
Because everybody, like, this is not English, everybody. This is back in the 90s teaching people. I'm like, it was a chain email. I was an etymology.
You ever tell us what's in it?
Yeah.
That is the municipal building that has lasted us the longest.
It looks
Our-
very old.
Right? But take a minute. Our oldest city
Yeah, it's
building
funny.
is the explosives warehouse. I mean,
It's still there.
Fires.
A miracle. By
But
a
I
miracle.
guess-
I love it. I think it's hilarious. Absolutely cracks me up.
I mean, it does look very old. We didn't. So when we did the carriage tour, the carriage tour went by it, but like didn't see
Didn't
that
see that
side
angle
of
of
the building.
it,
That's
yeah.
kind of like, that's kind of spooky looking.
And it is very cool. A lot of people use this one as a pirates. No further between black powder and pirates. There's something else. Might use black powder to fire cannons at pirates.
Yeah, I guess like.
But it's such a cool looking spot. Like, it's very
Yeah.
historic, very cool looking.
Yeah, that is nice.
I always want to tell personal stories about the Powder magazine, which are not really not what we're here for. So I'm like, I can't stop here. I'm gonna be telling personal stories. All right, guys. Speaking of which, I always point this out because these bricks are kind of sneaky and they'll catch you. But I want you to know that one time I had a big group and I turned around and I went, guys, watch out for the bricks. And then I immediately turned around and I walked full body into this. So
Oh,
Okay.
hard that my head whipped.
yeah.
Oh no.
Tricky.
This is not me, but
I was like, wow.
yeah,
Tricky.
bam.
And her imprint is still there.
So it hurt. Don't do that,
Yeah.
okay?
Okay.
Don't walk into the wall. Don't trip on the bricks. We're all gonna make it through safely. It's gonna be fun. To be fair though, it's kind of like a great and they all go, oh, at the exact same time.
Showing you what not to do.
See how I take it? I thought it was hilarious. Is this good?
Yeah.
Y'all are in charge of making sure I don't forget my drink. Oh, well, what are you doing? Here, stay here for a second. Excuse me, sir. Are you supposed to be in the trash can? Oh, he's so stinking cute and little. Come on, you almost never see raccoons in here. There's
Raccoons.
little guys being like, what are you doing? All right. Beg your pardon. Man, they kind of hit me out of nowhere. To be fair, I have been outdoors all day long
Yeah.
and haven't had allergy meds all day. I think I maybe had one this morning.
Oh,
So
there you go.
I'm so sorry. He's so stinking
Oh
cute.
dear, he is.
Honey, what are you doing? That's not a. There's like no food in there. It's a construction
Big-
trash can.
It's like,
There's got to be something.
I know.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Okay, let me take it. All right. I mean, we
talking
could.
to like a person in the trash can. I was like, hello.
I'm sorry. I thought it might be. Stand behind you again. There is a kitty cat that lives in that house. His name is Charlie. He is the ghost tour kitty. His owner actually lives in the Pirate House, which used to be a black market goods store and a brothel catering specifically to pirates.
Okay.
And he lets him out at night. And he's an orange tabby. And so he lives back in here. So he at night just hunts all through the graveyard and the cemetery, and it connects all the way through. He also loves the ghost tours because a couple of guides used to bring him treats. So he will go find a tour, and he's done this. I've seen him do it several times. So he'll come and he'll walk down the line of your people and sort of get pets if he feels like being petted. So he'll be petted, and he'll swipe at you, but otherwise he'll get petted, and then he'll flop down and he'll listen to a story. And at the end of the story, if no one's given him a treat, he gets up and he moves on and finds a new group. I have seen him by the Mills House Hotel. Like, I've seen him everywhere the ghost tours go.
Charlie's a man about town.
Charlie is a man about town. A story like this, everyone's looking over my shoulder into the graveyard, and he just pops up over a gravestone and flops down and hangs out on top of one of these graves. People are like, oh my gosh! And I'm like, yep. So, here we're gonna do. I'm gonna tell you guys my story, and I'm gonna do it like this. I just want to come stand here so that you're getting this view and not the light so much in your face. I want you to be able to see the graveyard. So wherever is comfortable, so you guys can look in there. All right. Well, this is a bush, like right here, so you don't have to be like right here. I was thinking on this side,
like
but
over here.
I'm gonna
like
scooch over and you can look this way. So, safety coffins is our neck. I'm gonna try not to be distracted by the raccoon. Actually, could I ask you to not have the that on? Yeah, it's kind of like right in my eyes. He's just a little skinny dude.
Yeah.
Where are you going?
I feel like they can easily
Slow.
They can. He's very outnumbered in town.
Yeah.
Go back home. Go back home. Maybe Charlie has a friend. All right. So we talked just briefly about safety coffins. These were a real thing. When we were talking about people being buried alive, like I said, they were aware that this was an issue. They just didn't know how to solve it. And there were a lot of different ideas proposed. Actually, one of my favorites, kind of a very early forerunner to the safety coffin concept, way early, back in like the 1600s, there was a priest, and his suggestion was that, I can't with this, that's good, was that every single person buried should be buried with a rope running from in their coffin all the way up to the bells in the steeple, so that if they woke up, they can ring the church bells. Have you ever seen someone ring a church bell?
They have to be like very strong. Did you?
They have to leap into the air and use their body weight to get it rolling. And I love the idea of like a tiny child who died of influenza being given a rope and being like strung up. Also the mental image of the graveyard, all the ropes heading up,
just
you know.
going on.
But I love it. But he was, he's on the right track. And so there were a lot of different designs proposed, but the one that you most hear about of the safety coffins is the kind that we were just talking about. Now, actually, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were dozens of designs for safety coffins patented just in the United States. So just the patented ones, just the US, just that period, dozens of designs. My personal favorite that I read about is actually, it had a delivery system that would allow you to send a plate of food and reading materials down into the coffin once it's in the ground. But there were no air holes.
Well, you could eat and you could read.
You would not be bored or hungry. You would also not be breathing. And the thing about that is that the man felt so strongly about the brilliance of the design that he had it patented. He filled out paperwork for this.
Someone's gonna steal this.
Right? I love this man. I want to shake his hand. But most of them are what we were talking about. Now, like you were saying, you would tie off sort of a cord or a string. But first of all, you've got the coffin in the ground, and it was connected to the surface through basically a pipe, just a simple tube or pipe. And then you would have your strong cord or very thin rope. And normally not so much a finger, just because it's just going to be hard to get a good grip on that, but like a wrist or an ankle. And the idea is that if they wake up, the first thing you're going to do is functionally panic, right? So you're going to start flailing around. So you want something thin, easily moved by the person without them having to know what's going on. And then it's going to run up through that pipe, and it would tie off to a little bell, usually hanging off a hook on the side of the gravestone. So really a pretty simple system, pretty straightforward, very practical. And then you would pay someone to sit up. This is that graveyard shift part. You would pay someone to sit up for a couple of nights with a shovel and wait for the bell to ring. And if the bell rings, you dig, right? That's the idea. So these were real things, and they, were used quite a bit. There's actually, I've had some folks on my tour tell me, this one guy from Wisconsin and somebody else from up in New England, tell me that in graveyards in their hometown, you can still see some of the hooks in the sides of the gravestones. So, I mean, the bells have long since been taken, the pipes have been pulled out, and the cords have rotted, but the hooks are the longest lasting part of this system. To my knowledge, we don't have any in Charleston, but if you find one, leave us a review and tell me about it, because I want to know where it is. I'm kind of telling everybody, like, y'all are my hunting group. You're going to go out and find me if we have any hooks left. But this is the idea. Now, this is our last story of the evening, and this is actually my very favorite ghost story in Charleston. And it is called The Legend of the Safety Car Salesman, which I kind of think is a really funny title, so that sort of adds to it for me.
Like, are you afraid of the dark?
Yeah, exactly. It's a long, extended, story. So, this story takes place in the late 1800s, and it is about a young man who was, as the title implies, a safety coffin salesman. Now, this was, like I said, the concept vaguely had been around for a long time, but it was kind of a hot new thing. And so he is traveling around the country, and he's selling safety coffins for a particular company that has designed these. He only intended to be in Charleston for, like a week or two. But as is so often the case, he met a young lady. And she's very lovely and very southern and very charming. And he starts to think, it's not such a bad city. I mean, I could spend a little more time here. And he ends up sticking around a little bit longer, and he gets an opportunity to meet her, and pretty soon they begin courting. After a while, they fall in love, he proposes, and he settles in Charleston permanently. Now, this young couple gets married, and everything's absolutely fantastic for a long time. He had no real family of his own, so her family just kind of adopted him. They actually got along really, really well. She has a large family, and her parents actually really like their new son-in-law. He's a smart guy, and everything is great. They get married in the spring, and perfectly fine for the rest of the year. And then the following winter rolls around. We get to January. Now, you guys are feeling a little bit of the cold weather that we get here. We do actually get quite cold. We don't get like hard freeze, but we get down well into freezing. And what we do is we get that combined with these epic storms coming in the like January, February zone. Now, we talked earlier about us being right on the harbor, right? So that's a time of year when a lot of people get sick because, the temperatures are going up and down all over the board. And historically, it was one of the main times of the year when we would get epidemics, which is really, really sad. Now, unfortunately, there was a fever that went sweeping through the city that year. I'm sorry, it's very illegal for anyone to be in there at all. Hang on just a second. Sure you're good. All right. They left the gate open. I've never seen it before, and it's
maybe it was
kind of awesome.
Maybe it was the spirits.
Maybe it was the spirits. These guys walked into a totally like kosher night. I'm really legitimately impressed. What was it? Did you like it? Did you see the little raccoon? Did you see the little raccoon in there?
No.
We just saw one went running in like right after you guys walked past there. So
He wanted to go on the tour.
He wanted to go on the tour. Have a good night, you guys. Thanks. So we're back to our story. I apologize for the interruption. Now, like I said, epidemic comes sweeping through the city that year, and it's a fever, and his wife falls ill. Now she fights it for as long as she can, but after just a couple of weeks, she passes away. So very, very sad. Of course, her husband is heartbroken, her family is heartbroken, and just like with the Lorenz family, they set about preparing for her funeral. They went ahead, her parents, and they buried her in the family plot, which is right back in the far corner of the graveyard. Her husband is convinced she will be coming back. Honestly, this is where his head is, right? It's what he does for a living. He's always selling people safety coffins, and so he has just sort of convinced himself that she's definitely not really dead. She's definitely going to be coming back. And he ensures that she is buried in the absolute top of the line, best quality model that he can get his hands on. Now, that first night, he goes out there by himself with a shovel, and he waits. All night long, nothing. The next morning, her family finds out that he was in the graveyard all night. They hear about this. They have no idea he intended to do this himself. And they immediately come out here and they're like, what are you doing? You've been, up for weeks. You've been tending to your wife. You're grieving. Let's hire someone. We need to hire a professional to do this. You need to come inside. And he said, no. She's going to ring for me. I have to be here. And no matter what they do, they can't talk him into it. And finally they're like, all right, we'll come and get you tomorrow. And that whole next night, he sits out here. This time they've brought him some supplies. They get him some food and a lantern, and he's got a coat. They bring him one of those big great coats that you see in the old pictures from the late 1800s. They've got like all the capes around the shoulders, so he's much better protected now from the elements and the cold. And he sits out here with a shovel all night long, waiting for the bell to ring. And nothing. They come out the next morning. All right, you need to come in. And he says, no. She's going to ring for me. I have to be here. And again, they cannot convince him to come inside. And it's the same the next night, and the next night, and the next night. Every day they're trying to bring him inside, but they're afraid to forcibly drag him in because he's clearly not thinking very clearly. He is kind of on the edge, and they don't want to push him over. But they can't talk him into it. And no matter what they say, she's going to ring for me. I have to be here. And by the end of that first week, her family knows. I mean, if she hasn't rung by now, she's not going to, right? But he really isn't thinking straight at this point, and he can't be convinced. Now, finally, they hit their limit. They just decide, you know what, that's it. If we have to, we're going to drag him inside, and they come out to try and convince him again. He talks them into one more night. She's going to ring. I have to be here. And they say, that's it. Tomorrow morning, we're dragging you in. And he agrees. That night, we had one of those storms blowing in off the coast. We get these crazy thunderstorms come rolling in, and it's all thunder and lightning long before the rain even starts. And this was combined with a real temperature drop that night, which again is a thing that we get in the spring and when it's really cold. And he's out here all hunkered down with his coat and his shovel, and the wind is whipping around and the lightning is going. And honestly, at this point, he's so exhausted, he's barely even conscious. And then, well after midnight, in the wee hours of the morning, all of a sudden, the bell starts to ring. And instantly, he snaps awake. He jumps up, he starts digging, and he gets all the way down to the coffin, absolutely frantic. And he uses the shovel and he leverages the lid back, he rips it off, and there is his wife. And a flash of lightning comes down and he can see her. And she is a week gone, exactly as she should be. And somewhere in the back of his mind, that last little bit of sanity clicks into place. And he realizes that the branches of the trees and the bushes ripping around in the wind had caught against the cord and rung the bell. And just then, the skies open up and the rain comes pouring down. Now, the next morning, sure enough, her family comes out just as soon as they can. It stormed all night, and they were really, really concerned about him. And as soon as they're able to come out and check, they do, and they find him in the coffin with his wife. has also passed away from exhaustion, exposure, and grief. They very carefully extricate him, and they re-bury their daughter right back in the family plot. And they bury her husband alongside her in a perfectly normal coffin. Now, if you were ever passing by this graveyard at night, especially on a stormy or windy night, listen for the bells. And if you hear one, have a look. Because you may occasionally catch a glimpse of a large figure in a greatcoat with a shovel over his shoulder, because he is always here, waiting for those bells to ring. And that was our last story of the evening. All right?
Yes. Believe it.
You see, that's one of my favorites. And that is it, you guys. That's it. How did we do? Did you guys have fun?
Oh, yeah.
Super informative.
Great.
Yeah,
Very
we
spooky.
Entertaining.
we did the history, we did the ghost stories, all the
Yeah.
things. What did you say, sorry?
Yeah, it's informative and educational.
Like I said, I used to be a teacher. There's a lot more of the history on my tour than some people, but I hope you guys enjoy it. Well, thank you so much for coming out with Revolutionary Charleston, Morbid Charleston tours. If you had fun, we love feedback. Reviews really help us out. TripAdvisor, Google reviews, all that kind of stuff. I am not abandoning you on like a random street corner between two burial grounds. I am going to be heading back to the park where we started, which we can go via if you guys want to go past like the Mills house. You sound like you were heading north. But if I can give any directions, if I can point you guys the right way, or if you want to walk with me back to where we came from, what do you reckon? Anybody want directions? Anybody want to walk with me? You know where you're heading?
Yeah, we'll just walk with you.
Cool. Sounds good. Are
Yeah,
you
I
good?
will.
You gonna come
Yeah, I
with me
will.
too? Fantastic. All right.
Don't forget your drink.
Thank you. See, I really count on you guys. I am going to put this away, especially if I'm fussing at them about things. I'm not allowed to take tour groups back in here, so we are now officially not a tour group. We are off tour. Okay. It's a residential area, so they don't want us taking groups into like where people live at night, which I think is actually a really good rule. Okay. What's up? Don't think that's supposed to be open. And if I'm wrong, it's okay. I've never been like this.
What was the man's name? He was waiting by his watch screen.
I don't actually have a name.
Yeah, it was like sprinkling.
I feel so bad because like they totally left out and that's awesome. From the other store and I was like, well, earlier it was like, I remember it was like 5 groups of like 20 and they were all like school groups. It was all teenagers. And so I was like, it would be very easy for a bunch of teenagers to get away and the two graveyards back onto each other with a fence. And I was like,
So this is a French Quarter. They call this French Quarter.
the French Quarter, yes.
Oh, just like in
Like in New Orleans.
New Orleans, yes.
But it's
Oh,
called the French.
so there is. That's why I noticed those terraces.
Not really.
Some building and house they have terrace. Lawns.
The balcony.
Yeah, balcony. I mean.
Here's the thing. It's called French Quarter because in the 1970s, the city of Charleston thought to themselves, you know, New Orleans has a French Quarter. People like that.
Maybe
We
should
should have a
brand
French
it, yeah.
Quarter. And yeah, they just started putting French
A
Quarter on the
branding
signage.
exercise.
Now, don't get me wrong, we had a lot of French folks.
That's a French.
That's the French Huguenot Church, and that's why they picked this neighborhood to call the French Quarter. But this was never a neighborhood that was like all French folks. It wasn't.
Makes.
What it really is the northern half of the walled city. The oldest part of the city, this is the north half, and that's where the French Quarter on.
Oh.
So we had a lot of French folks. We just didn't call it the French Quarter. That's a modern, does it make sense?
Yeah.
And the balconies that you're seeing, actually, most of what we have in Charleston are not French design. Most of them are English.
Oh, English.
Although we have some mix because we did have a lot of French words. So it's a little, it does remind a lot of people of New Orleans.
Yes.
Because there's similar era, like similar time period, and because you did have French in both places. These were the French Protestants. The French Catholics were in New Orleans. French Protestants were being murdered in France by the French Catholics, so they came here to stay. It was a lot of drama for a long time. It was a French drama. Actually, Europe was kind of one giant hate match between Catholics and Protestants for a really long time.
What are these like S's?
Those are earthquake bolts.
Okay. Okay.
So what you're looking at is like the washer part of the bolt.
Okay.
It's called a jib.
Okay.
But it's supposed to be a jib.
Okay.
And it's what braces the bracing system against the outside building.
Okay.
So, did you learn about the earthquake bolts?
Yeah, our guy told me about it today.
You see them in tons of different shapes. X's and S's and crosses and lions heads and
I
stars.
guess that makes sense.
Circles.
Well, we have in a lot of the buildings in DC, they have those stars in the sides of the building.
Do they?
I don't know if that is for earthquakes.
DC might be on the Woodstock Fault. I don't know.
It is.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
what our guide was telling us. So
Yeah.
maybe it is because they're like a lot of the buildings in Georgetown have the stars. Like
That
on the
bracing
side.
system is basically for any like brick building that has been knocked off its axis. So you'll see it over in like England and some other places.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but you see it. We call them earthquake bolts because we use it for earthquakes. So
Yeah.
in different places,
They use them.
regional towns, but it's the same bracing system.
Yeah.
So that was a really good question about the French Quarter. I didn't mean to shoot you down about it, like you were so excited. I guess some people are like, "Are we going to the French Quarter?" And I'm like, "Yes, but it's not the French Quarter."
But technically, no.
I don't know what to.
It's
I
a
don't know what to
branded
tell
French
you.
Quarter.
But it's the. I kind of think they missed out on opportunity because not every city had a walled city like that.
Yeah.
At the time, there were only 3 walled cities in the Americas, like
Pretty
European cities. So that's to me really special, and I wish they leaned into that. But
I think it's cool.
it's either way, it's fun, and it's actually a really entertaining story to tell people that that's from the 1970s. I feel like I shoot them down.
PR effort.
Yeah, there you go. All right, well, good luck. Have a
All
good
right.
night.
Thank you.
so much for the tour.
Thank you, ma'am.
Leave us a review. Let us know if you hear something. So,
We will.
yeah.
Well,
Thank you
good
for
night.
coming.
Yeah,
Have a
thank
great
you.
night.
Good night.
Are you good? You know where you're headed?
Oh, I just take a lift from here.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. Perfect. These good chairs you can relax.
Yeah.